Hello. What a pleasure. What a joy. It is such a pleasure. And I have to say, it's my first time on this stage, and I'm kind of impressed. I was already impressed when I had to run through the masses here, because usually I'm a digital watcher of Republica, a person on the sidelines. As Neil said, I come from the old realm of the wooden media. I think a lot of you read a lot, but you're noticing this world only from the side of your eyes. I am publishing a magazine, the biggest in Germany, which exists for 70 years. And of course, we were looking at the digital media from the beginning. One of our employees was won by Markus Beckedahl. But why I'm here has other reasons, and that's why I'm especially thankful and happy. I think I can say this is the first Republica on which there is a German chancellor promoting a change of policies towards Israel. That's a political statement, and it shows how the digital, without the real world, and I am consciously saying geopolitically, how the digital is developing in such a big way. And we have to look at this quite differently than we were able to do this 30 years ago. Annika Brockschmidt also said right before, she also published in our March edition, Elon Musk coup with USB drives. So the description, Markus Beckedahl also said, there is an energy of a coup. Looking at the United States, seems like a coup, not with tanks, but through concerted effort to destroy the state. This has already been said before, but I want to open up our vision and ask the question, where were we roughly 20 years ago when this movement started? Republica started in 2007, the first one. 1 year earlier, the Pirate Party was founded. It feels almost nostalgically. And I want to ask in 3 different stages, where were we coming from then? And my primary thesis is we're coming from a big position of post. The great hope, which was still fueled by 1989-90. But where are we today? And the third point would be, how do we get out of this mess? And I really want to say we're in a dramatic dialectic of digitalization. We are in a situation where we have to make ourselves consciously aware that the progress reached through the digital will go back into the negative, and there will be digital progress on the other side. So that's the tension I'm addressing. Post-post-materialism and post-post-militarism, which is catching up with us a little bit today. Where did we start 20 years ago? Let me tell you an anecdote. I was sitting in our office, next to me a young intern, an editorial intern, Julia Schramm. She was writing in her explosive way of writing a tiny essay. Click Me, I think was the name, or something like that. The header was, we're reaching a time of post-privacy, and I've never seen anything like that. In our editorial team, the publishers were calling, we need to write a book about post-privacy. The big promise, the digital space is such a promise. We can put everything there, and there will be a non-regulated space. We can put everything there. Privacy can be freed up. And I was already in doubt then that new land that we weren't familiar with, because like I am still a boomer. I'm just kind of the pre-band. On this stage, a digital minister has his first thing. He's a post-boomer. I am born in '67. But in the big narrative, I am a boomer, and that means I'm basically the same as Friedrich Merz, born in 55. And that's crazy. The narrative of boomer doesn't really fit the topic boomer. We need to be quite skeptic about stencils. So he was my father, born 35, did not even have to serve in the military because there was no military of Germany at this point. And that shows that the characterization as a boomer is not sufficient. I am not native. I was no native. I've never played a computer game in my life, I have to confess here, which is probably unimaginable to the majority of you today here. Julia Schramm and I were sitting next to each other. We're discussing a long way from the Pirate Party, which ended up in the Left Party. But that was the time of such a great hope. The hope that the post-materialism could win. Like would be like an avant-garde of the post-material, a space without government, communicate in new ways, and something that is free. And that was the big hope of that time. And at the same time, post-materialism was also a hope. If we dematerialize, if we're able to communicate without moving, if we do it digitally, then we are going to dematerialize this world up to a point. And digital revolution is the avant-garde of post-materialism. And I'm going to go one step further. It's an idea of creating peace. Communicating in the global space is one opportunity to deal with each other in peace. And that was an expression of the zeitgeist of the 80s and 90s. Who of you was in Berlin? I was happy enough to be in Berlin at that time. I experienced how the 90s were here. There was a depoliticization, anything goes. And the love parades, which were kind of stupid, under the big header, peace, love, pancakes. That was the slogan of the 90s. It was a kind of a narcissism. It was depoliticized, and we thought it was the end of history, peace, freedom, and it was even clear then something capitalism which was out of control. But the idea of the digital, as we all saw, was very, very optimistic. So if we're thinking back, the issues were coming closer and closer. The end of the Pirate Party, which you might have been part of here in Berlin, was dramatic. But it's much more dramatic what Annika Brockschmidt discussed right here. And I want to go further. We also have to discuss the other side. There was a lot of discussion about the US, but we also have to look at the other side. The geopolitical image in Europe and the image of responsibility in the digital and the situation we're in isn't clear if we're not talking about the next epochal change that's happening. And that is much more dramatic for the digital question. The first change was in 2014. War in Ukraine. But the big turning point was 2022. Trump was the second turning point, which made everything more dramatic. But we have to stay at the first turning point, the invasion of Ukraine. So the hope of peace in Europe, peace and getting rid of borders in Europe, that hope was destroyed. It was something that had a lot to do with us, and it has a lot to do with our different generational conflicts that we went into this naively. We can say this for all of the generations. After 1989, the hope of a unified, peaceful Europe, or perhaps even a unified world, that idea that especially Europe, who was saying war, never again, which was something that meant something very specifically for us Germans, who started two wars in the past century. So the logic of our generation, the boomers and the generation before, we, first of all, have to make sure that Germany will never become a war actor again. In that moment, when the Soviet Union ended, that was a moment, ironically, where it wasn't the left parties, the Green Party or the SPD. It was a minister of a conservative government who took this decisive step, giving the answer that the fundamental pacification of Europe would be getting rid of the military. And you all know who was that. It wasn't SPD, it wasn't Green, it was Karl Theodor Gutenberg. So the answer was coming from those who usually were in charge of the state, is primarily, which goes back to Thomas Hobbes, that there is a societal contract where the government promises security above everything. Security, safety needs to be made sure. And for that, the citizens have to serve in moments of crisis. And this seemed impossible, but we got rid of the necessity of military service in Germany. And we felt this brutally when war in Ukraine happened. We all felt it. The people in Ukraine felt it most. It was such a big crime day by day, but also now. Putin is proving this with such a cynicism. Let's hope that even Donald Trump noticed this. Donald Trump, who laid Zelensky to Putin's feet and said, I made him do concessions on all fronts, make peace, Vladimir. And Putin, as we saw last night, yeah, you can negotiate with us. Let's call them talks with second-tier, third-tier people, but I am going to keep on doing this war. Meaning the break of everything that even Russia promised 1989, that borders would stay in place, the promise that we would have a Europe that is safe, which is something that we brutally woke up from 2 or 3 years ago. And the word in question isn't turning point. The more interesting word is something Mr. Mais said. We are naked. We're materially bare in Europe. We have a lot of weapons, but they're not coordinated. That given the fact, even though we have a lot of investment in the military infrastructure in Europe, but we're just losing the support of that power which was guaranteeing our security for so many decades. So without this power, we cannot match Russia at this point. Basically, we knew this since 2022, but we were always kind of trusting that, on the other hand, on the other side, the US would always be ready to save us. And this era, the justified era, and the era that was even noted by Obama, the question that, dear Europeans, it's not self-evident that after the end of the Cold War, which I would actually call Cold Peace, 45 to 89, that wasn't a cold peace. Mutually assured destruction, all of that, but it was a balance. But then the US told us, starting with George Bush, you Europeans need to start ensuring your own safety. And that is going to be thrown in our face again brutally in the situation with Donald Trump. We're in a situation where we have to answer two big questions. On the one hand, the fact that hopes of post-materialism, which I described, did not come to place. Where are we today? We experience that the freedom from consumption, freedom from consumerism in the digital realm is actually the opposite. There's a lot of energy spent on the web and permanently colonizing new areas in our cognitive realms. And this is going on and on and on. A French intellectual described this really well. He called it the greediness of capitalism, with an example which is still quite interesting. Capitalism created freedom, but it was always able to conquer new and new realms. And he showed this, and thus communication was replaced by this to a degree. He used an interesting example. He said, in the past, in France, freedom wasn't all that present. Women washing their laundry, maybe you know that, they were washing their laundry on big public spaces. They were communicating. It was an exchange. It was care work done by women, but industrialization gave freedom to women, but also brought a dominion over this space. There was a washing machine in all the homes. This development has two sides. It gave freedoms, but it also created spaces of materialism. And the last big materialist conquest was the internet, the digital realm. This land acquisition of the cognitive, which was freed before that. Every child having a cell phone and sits on it for hours. That's something you really have to say it's an anthropological change. Because something that was very normal in my generation, boredom, not having to do something, is excluded now. It's fundamentally impossible now. And that creates or conquers spaces for commercial exploitation. And the most dramatic development is in the crypto world bubbles. I'm not even going to go into what that means for financial monopolies and also for the state. But I just want to say the materialistic character. Even the word is crazy. Mining Bitcoin. We were mining minerals and metals, and then we're saying we're mining Bitcoin with gigantic computers which are needing lots and lots of electricity. And this is something where we can see that post-materialism has completely become something different. Markus Beckedahl will also ask the question, but the post-material discourse is going so much further. We're going to have to say this in other places, but right now I'm interested in the turn to the opposite on the militaristic side. I actually would have to call it military, because militaristic has a negative connotation, and that's not adequate for the current situation. We were hoping, as I said before, that we will experience a big civilizatory effort, a pacification, and a fundamental pacifism that Germany took from having two wars was shattered by something we didn't expect, that another country, Russia, wasn't just as pacifistic as Germany was. As they say, the most pious person cannot live in peace if their neighbor doesn't like that. So something that happens every day is something that leads to having to answer how we deal with the digital and which answers we need to give in the digital regarding to war. And that situation is tragic. We're all thankful that Germany has gone away from their warlike ways fundamentally. Sarah Wagenknecht, the last time she was in Parliament, had such an forgetting of history. And she propagated an identity saying that the credits that were taken, something that we need to give to the Ukraine right now. This is something which ignores the war Russia is raging, and that's very close to 2014. But which answer are we going to give today in this situation, to this tragic situation, when we have to become conscious of the fact that the situation of Germany today is that war is no hope anymore. It's not something that we're hopeful about. It's a necessary evil, perhaps, but it's something that everybody wants to get rid of, with all the many questions that come with that. And I think we will need to discuss these questions fundamentally in the upcoming years. For instance, talking about the mandatory service in the military. But is it enough to practice this mentality? And it's a justified mentality. If it's so deep in our psyche that every person dying on a battlefield is one too many, then we have to ask the question more and more, which are the means with which we can repel a real enemy, at least somebody who sees us as an enemy? Russia sees the collective West as an enemy with which we're already in a hybrid war. What is our answer? You're talking about generations, and a lot of the younger people there's a young man walking through the talk show saying, I would never go to war for the state. And I'm surprised at the emphasis that the man uses. But then the question remains, who is going to defend not only Germany, but also the European Union, in Lithuania, for instance? So if all of us have the opinion that every life that's sacrificed in war is a tragedy, then the digital question becomes quite fundamental. And if we're making ourselves conscious of how Ukraine managed to beat back the Russian attacks, then we see that the digital revolution was decisive there. It was drones, it was weapons that we could not have imagined a few years back, and we wouldn't have wanted to imagine then. 10 years ago, we had a justified debate about Kunduz. Maybe a few of you remember. There was a terrorist attack. Children, adults were dying in Afghanistan. There was bombs on a train because they thought wrongly that there were weapons in that train. And then we had this debate, are we allowed to wage war from a distance with automated weapons? That's a very fundamental question, because the perpetrators are immune and untouchable when they wage war from the distance. But we cannot forget something. If we have the opinion, putting humans at risk in war, that's something we cannot do because, for instance, we're in a much weaker position, or because we think it's too valuable, then we will have to think about the question, which digital equipment do we need? Ukraine had to give this answer because their only choice, their only opportunity to answer to Russia's attacks was defending themselves creatively with drones, next to the grenades that the West was providing them. Not enough. We promised more. That's why Russia was so superior, and that's why there's such a desperation in Ukraine against that superiority of Russia. But when they were able to defend themselves, they were because they were able to use the digital revolution as something on the battlefield that equalizes this battlefield to some degree. And it allowed them to defend themselves. And that's what I call the dialectic of digitalization. The big promise turns into the opposite of realizing that in a world that is so digitalized as we have it right now, also in Europe, with the war in the Ukraine, that we cannot just postpone this question by saying, we have to get rid of everything which enables war. We will have to answer the question, in how far is something like digital weaponization necessary to protect human life? So we cannot just live with a promise, a hope. We are in times where the digital realm is something we need to understand as something which is a part of what we used to think of as evil, the military. But today, it's doing something we need desperately to defend ourselves, to defend what we consider democracy, and which is part of the hope which Republica stands for. Freedom from dominion, maybe revolution, and we are disillusioned about this to a great degree these days. Thank you very much.